Our final panelist is Cheryl Chung, who is going to talk to us about bridges and bypassing. Cheryl is another dear friend. In fact, the whole panel is all dear friends, right? I should just get that out of the way, right? They are wonderful and brilliant people, and the kind of people you watch and feel incredibly humbled by. But Cheryl is going to talk to us about some of her work, not just in government, where she was originally a futurist in our Ministry of Trade and Industry and later on at the Prime Minister's office, but also now at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where she not only works on strategic planning for the school, she also teaches foresight to some of the students. So I think she lives and breathes and probably dreams foresight as well. And I'm looking forward very much, Cheryl, to hearing what you have to share with us today.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. I wear many hats, so sometimes I'm a little bit confused at which identity I bring to a talk. But today, I'm bringing my social entrepreneur identity. And if you indulge me, what I will spend the next couple of minutes doing is taking you on a walk through an area in Singapore, and what I see as a social entrepreneur with a futures foresight background. So the artifact, I followed instructions, so my artifact is a bridge, and let's take a little bit of a walk in Singapore around a set of bridges around the Singapore River. Before I take you on this walk, I think one of the things I wanted to bring out when we talk about bridges is really what are we bridging? And I think the first thing that came to mind was the opening lines of Tale of Two Cities and saying that, you know, it was the best of times and the worst of times. And very often I feel that in a country like Singapore, and many times it's the best of times, and in many ways it's also the worst of times. And I'm pretty interested in seeing what does it mean to bridge some of these different aspects, these different inequalities in Singapore. So this is the area that I'm going to take you on a walk. This is obviously the Singapore River. Marina Bay will be that away, so just if you want to orientate yourself. And the area I want to show you is this little area that's kind of in this red bubble. On the, above the river, that's Robertson Quay. So for those of you who are familiar with Singapore, that would be an area where a lot of bars, a number of historic buildings, a lot of residences. It's got a beautiful riverside walk. And on the other side, so on the other side of Havelock Road, at the bottom end of that circle, is an area called Jalan Kukoh. Jalan Kukoh is quite interesting because it is one of actually the poorest areas in Singapore, and obviously Robertson Quay is one of the wealthiest. So the first bridge I wanted to show you is this bridge called the Alkahf Bridge, and it's a beautiful bridge. A lot of you, if you're familiar with the area, will notice it from because of its color and its you know, I mean, it's kind of very beautifully decorated. And normally, what you would do is you would start from the Robertson Quay end, maybe after dinner, maybe after a couple of drinks, and maybe you'd stroll at night over the Alkahf Bridge. The Alkahf Bridge is pretty interesting because depending on which way you look, you see different things. So if you are standing on the Alkahf Bridge, if you look one way, you see Robertson Quay, and this is part of what we call the Singapore River Planning Area. And I think this is pretty interesting from a foresight of futures perspective because as futurists, you know, there is a very big part of the work which is active, right? That we generally view that we have quite a high level of agency over the future. You know, you hear futurists say things like, you know, you don't predict the future, but you create it or you invent it. There is this activeness about it. I think the other part is also that when there is, you know, these big futures type visions, there is also generally quite a lot of coherence because the planning allows for that coherence. And that gives you a sense of maybe stability or coordination, having your act together. And that's definitely the feeling that you get walking along the Robertson Quay side of the city, of the river, I mean. On the other end, you have Jalan Kukoh, which is, if you can see, it's actually blocked. It's actually on a slight, well, I was used to using the word hill because the word hill in Singapore means very different from the word hill in other countries. But it's at a slight elevation. Not that, you know, and it's behind, you know, a bunch of trees and not easy to spot if you don't really know what you're looking for in that sense. But it's quite an interesting area because as you walk across the bridge, the Alkahf Bridge, you will hit a overhead bridge to go into Jalan Kukoh. And the moment you start to transition into this space across these bridges, you start to move from a space of visual coherence to a space of what we call visual clutter. The most recent time I went on a walk there, I do some work in Jalan Kukoh, so quite familiar with the area. But the last time I went on a walk there, I went with an architect friend, and her narrative about the architecture and pointing out, this difference between visual coherence and visual clutter was quite striking to me. And this is really a tale of two cities. And I think, for me, I've been quite interested in my futures work. I do some work in Smart Nation and kind of data-related issue, and I'm pretty interested in this idea of the narrative behind the numbers. And when you look at, if you compare Robertson Quay to Jalan Kukoh, without even talking about income-related or kind of economic status, you do get a sense that they are quite different communities, even though they are basically just separated by an overhead bridge. Robertson Quay obviously is mostly university educated. You have many young working professionals, and Jalan Kukoh mostly is more lowly educated, and you have actually less working professionals and quite a lot of elderly. This is also because this planning area includes the Chinatown area as well. So, you do have a lot more elderly residents. But the interesting thing I wanted to point out, which I found interesting in looking at the data, was the languages that people speak. And this, to me, is another bridge. It's an intangible bridge. But what you have is actually, in Robertson Quay, you have many people who are multilingual, which means that, let's say, if they spoke Mandarin, they would also speak English. And English then provides a bridge in that community to be able to communicate with each other. In an area like Jalan Kukoh, you do not have that luxury in a way because people generally are monolingual. So if you do not speak my language, that's immediately already a barrier to us communicating. And so that's kind of my first thought about the role of a museum. I wonder when I do social entrepreneur type work, who are the bridge builders in a community? I do wonder about things like what are some intangible bridges? And specifically related to this conference and this topic, I do wonder what is the role of a museum for the future as a bridge building institution? In the same area, there is another bridge. And this is the view of the CTE, the expressway from Chin Swee Road. For those of you who are Singaporean, if you know Red Star, the dim sum, the old school dim sum place, basically it's on one side of the street. And this is interesting because it's also a bridge in a way, as a expressway linking two places. But it has another effect. Ignore my transparency sketching. But basically, if you compare the plan of the area during the Japanese occupation and maybe the 80s URA master plan, you start to see that actually, and it's all looking at the same area, right? So the Jalan Kukoh area, just below the river, is actually quite, from a planning perspective, quite integrated with Chin Swee and Pearl Hill, which is on the other side of that street. Then what happens in 1980, what's reflected in the 1985 plan is actually the yellow line, which is the Chin Swee Road. They built Chin Swee Road through it, which has the effect of bypassing the area in a way. And if you look at the next slide, which is, I think, the current master plan, you see the same area, and that's actually become the central expressway. So clearly there is actually, and if you are physically in that space, it's a really, I mean, it's not a road you jaywalk across, and it has the effect of actually bypassing this particular community. And I think for me that's the other function of a museum for the future. I think museums, there needs to be a conversation about not just that coherent futures vision and projecting that coherent futures vision, but also a conversation about who has been left behind, what has been lost or forgotten, and how can a museum of the future remember the bypassed. Because I think museums of the future are fundamentally about change, and I think Future's work is fundamentally about change. But how can we talk about change without talking about loss? And I do wonder about the role of an institution in that remembering, in that almost mourning and almost lamentation. And this is my last my last slide. I think for me, there's a lot of conversation about museums playing that bridge, museums of the future playing that bridge function. And this is a function of hope, possibility, creation, connection, intention. But I do wonder about museums of the future also playing this role of honoring that bypass to commemorate grief, lost, being left behind, or being ignored. Thank you very much.